This is a special presentation of WOKR Eyewitness News, The Riots, 20 years later. Here is Don Alhart.
Good evening. We shall spend the next hour looking back over the past 2 decades. Our starting point, July 25th, 1964, the start of 2 days of rioting within Rochester's black community. Using news film and broadcasts of 20 years ago, we'll retell the events of those 48 hours. We'll also talk with police and community leaders in place 20 years ago, now able to look back and put it all into perspective. And we'll look back over those years since the riots. 20 years that have produced changes in neighborhoods, police-community relations, housing, and jobs. One of those in place then and now was Channel 13 anchorman Dick Burt, one of those to bring the news of the riots to Rochester television viewers.
The riots of '64 began right about here. It was a hot, sultry July. Temperatures had been in the 90s. Hanover houses were back over there, the high-rise apartments built after World War II to provide low-income housing. But Joseph Avenue has really changed. There were shops on both sides of the street as far as the eye could see. Little stores selling food and clothing and appliances. It was a busy, vibrant street. The spark that triggered the riot began here at Nassau and Joseph late Friday night. A group known as the Northeast Mothers Improvement Association had secured a permit for a street dance here on Nassau Street. Over 400 people were in attendance. Among them, members of a youth group called the Unsettlers. About 11:30, as the dance was about to break up, there was a disturbance, and police moved in to arrest 20-year-old Randy Manigault. And that's when the trouble began. At 11:40, police backup arrived. The crowd grows. Broken bottles are everywhere. At midnight, a police loudspeaker is used in efforts to disperse the crowd. But the mood has grown ugly. Police cars are the targets of bottles and rocks. By 12:45, some 15 arrests have been made. At 1 o'clock, Police Chief William Lombard's car is overturned and widespread looting begins. A call to the suburban towns brings in additional police support from Greece and Brighton. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the situation is completely out of hand. Public Safety Commissioner Donald Corbett is on the phone to the governor's office and asked for state police help. Some 400 troopers are mobilized, report for duty, and are on the street by 7 o'clock in the morning. By daylight, the situation eases and reveals a scene of utter chaos on Joseph Avenue. Scores of storefront windows have been broken, stores looted of everything from TV sets and clothing to fur coats and liquor. DPW crews move in to clean up the broken glass. Emotions are running high. The city's only elected black official, Constance Mitchell, says she's been threatened.
I received 2 anonymous phone calls that informed me that I, along with other niggers, needed to get out of town, and that if I didn't, my house was going to be blown up.
Saturday afternoon, civil authorities, up most of the night, strive to put the lid back on. City Manager Porter Homer announces a state of emergency. Mayor Frank Lamb holds talks with representatives of the city's black community and appeals for calm.
I urge all of you to abide by the curfew order of the city manager, to use sound judgment and good common sense. All of us, rich, poor, of one faith or another, of one color or another, have more to lose than to gain if this senseless abandonment to lawlessness continues.
But all efforts to keep the peace fail. Saturday night, the trouble spreads to the city's Near East Side, around Clarissa and Plymouth Avenue. Then, the first fatality. It was a white man in his 40s. No one knew much about him or what he was doing here. His name was John Bryant, or Judson Brer, and he was hit on the head during this wild melee that was taking place on Clarissa Street and fell into the street. An automobile seeking to bypass a police barricade rushed down the street, drove over him, and killed him. Mass arrests are overpowering the city's facilities. Carload after carload of suspects are brought to the lockup. Before it's all over, 976 persons will be arrested. Most are charged with violating the curfew. They're given suspended sentences. But 88 people will be indicted for serious crimes, including 9 felonies. By Sunday, July 27th, the struggle to contain the outbreak reached its height. The city's near north and west sides were a shambles. 1,000 National Guardsmen patrolled the streets. State troopers, along with city and town police, were at every corner. But then, disaster struck. The county's civil defense director, Colonel Robert Abbott, wanted to view the troubled areas from a helicopter. As James Dougherty piloted the craft over the 3rd Ward, he lost control. The plane spun into a large frame house and exploded in flames. The pilot was killed instantly, as were 2 residents of the house. There are just a few houses still standing on Clarissa Street today, 20 years after the airplane went down over there. But at that time, the housing here in the 3rd Ward was some of the worst in the entire city of Rochester. Hundreds of people jammed into housing on either side of this street. The crash of the airplane marked the turning point in the rioting. Now there were 4 people dead, and a 5th, Colonel Abbott, would die of his injuries. Throughout the hot weekend, Rochester's TV stations struggled to report what was taking place. Curfew is in effect and will be in effect until 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. This is for the entire city of Rochester. At 5 o'clock, the sale of all alcoholic beverages was terminated and will remain that way until 5 o'clock tomorrow. Talk shows were hastily set up with representatives of the black community to give exposure to their concerns. What had caused the outbreaks? One of the first of their kind in the entire nation. What changes were needed? Sunday, August 3rd, 1964. Rochester had been an armed camp for over a week. But now order had been restored. And the National Guard, which was bivouacked here at the base of Cobb's Hill, packed up in their giant trucks and went home. Governor Rockefeller sent Monroe County a bill for $153,641 to pay for the Guard. He said he'd take care of the state police. But the cost to Rochester's psyche, to its civic pride, could never be calculated, and race relations would never be quite the same again. In any event, the riots of '64 were over.
We had hoped at this point in our program to bring you live a reunion of 4 black leaders who met 20 years ago to try to stop the riot from spreading. But we can't do that tonight at the request of Local 791 of the Teamsters Union, which is on strike against Channel 13. The black leaders have withdrawn from tonight's broadcast. In the words of one community leader, Rochester was awakened by the riots, awakened to the inequities that grew out of difference. More on that in a moment.
There was a man got up and his clothes were on fire. It reminded you of a movie. And he started running this way.
Save 20 to 40% store-wide at Marple's summer sale on brand name furniture, carpeting, and bedding. Hurry for these savings at either Marple Furniture, Hilton, or Fairport.
You want my opinion on the death penalty? I'm against it. We can't go around killing or giving convicts. Where's our sense of decency? Justice.
People's opinions aren't just black and white. That's why on Donahue we explore every side of an issue and never duck anything.
Someone's getting away with murder, and I think it's the courts. Criminals.
Donahue. Television has never seen a talk show like it.
Weekday mornings at 9 on 13. Rockport, part of the Rochester Sesquicentennial Celebration.
With illegal drugs, users become losers.
I lost all control. I needed money for drugs and it made me crazy. I held my own father up at gunpoint. My own father. To get the money, I think I would have killed him if I had to. Teenagers, don't let anyone kid you. Drugs and alcohol can kill. Parents, don't kid yourself. The danger's all around you. Talk to each other.
With illegal drugs, users become losers.
When retarded people live in supervised group homes, what do they do during the day? Debbie Poole assembles safety goggles. Goggles that will help keep other workers safe. Being retarded never stopped anyone from being a good neighbor.
The neighborhood just north of the Conrail tracks in downtown Rochester has seen dramatic changes in the past 20 years. Al White has a report on the physical changes that have taken place.
I'm coming up, Jesus, on the rough side of the mountain.
Rochester's riot-torn neighborhoods have undergone a dramatic change over the past 20 years. 20 years ago, most of this neighborhood was strewn with broken glass and trash. Today, children play on clean streets, the kind of scene old folks only dreamed about. 20 years ago, there were rows and rows of crime-ridden slums. Today, many families in the same area live in homes they can be proud of. For example, in 1964, one of the worst apartment complexes in town was Hanover Houses. Everyone called it the Projects. It was cramped, hot, and full of crime and drugs. After demolition by the city, it was replaced with modern low-income housing.
Many of the slums that disappeared are vacant lots today. Under a massive urban renewal program, more than 12,000 families were reshuffled during the past 20 years.
During the facelift, many whites as well as some blacks fled to the suburbs. 65-year-old Bill and Christine Smith of 122 Tremont Street stayed. Today, the retired bus company supervisor and Kodak security worker live in the same house they lived in for 42 years. They recall how during the 1964 riot, their house narrowly missed being struck by a crashing civil defense helicopter.
This house was the last house that it cleared. It was flying very, very low, and they went to circle over, and when the next house, the propeller hit the roof of the house, and the helicopter burst into flame, and it fell right there in the street.
Christine ignored state police standing orders for blacks not to leave their property and rushed to the aid of the crash victims.
I looked up. There was a man got up, and his clothes were on fire. It reminded you of a movie, and he started running this way, and they ran to him and started pulling his clothes off. I had some sheets that I had just had been folding, and I just walked out to look at him. And when they started stripping his clothes off, well, then I ran down and took the sheet for them to wrap him in, and that was Colonel Abbott.
Were you afraid during this time? Did the cops said stay in your yard and in your house?
Well, when you see something like that, you forget about everything else, except this man needed some help.
Since the riots, dozens of neighborhood improvement projects skyrocketed property values for many inner-city residents. And also, there were changes in work opportunities for blacks. Opportunities the Smiths say didn't exist before the riots.
It wasn't easy to become a supervisor. I started out as a bus driver. In fact, when I first went to the bus company, I was turned down. And I was a veteran. I came out of World War II as an honorable discharge. So
Were you turned down because of your race?
I don't know why I was turned down. There must, I believe, as I look back, that they didn't want too many blacks in that particular job at that time. I kept going back. And finally, they gave me a job as a maintenance, in the maintenance area.
I had gone to Langston University and made some good grades. And I came here and I went to Eastman Kodak. And I told them I wanted a secretary job. And they told me, no, we don't have many secretary jobs, and we want those for our white girls. There's a job out in the factory you can have. So I took it. And I stayed there 18 years. And I only moved out of that after the riots. And I moved up to the office and got a secretary job. And I stayed there a while, and then they moved my boss, and I took his job. And I stayed there about 3 years, and they moved the next boss up, and I took his job. But I served Kodak faithfully and well. They didn't give me anything. I earned it.
Better job opportunities and better housing in the 3rd and 7th wards did bring about a better quality of life during the past 20 years. But one change wasn't so good. The riots caused most of the white-owned businesses to leave their neighborhoods. They were never replaced. Some residents are bitter about their forced departure.
It's worse now. It didn't help now. The riot didn't help any. It made it worse. You could come on Joseph and get anything you want. You understand me? Anything. Everything was here. You don't have nothing now. You got to walk a mile to get a loaf of bread.
However, black entrepreneurs like Nate Simmons of 580 Joseph Avenue are determined to make a go of it. Nate's opening a Southern barbecue restaurant.
I notice you have a nice storefront window here, which is nice and necessary for a business. But I know some other places, like the grocery store next door and that, and some others, they have boarded up or blocked off windows and that.
I'm not worrying about the window getting bust. I'm worrying about pleasing the customer. You always put another window there. If a lot of places take the windows and guard off or whatever, or the steel bars, they would be surprised what Joseph Avenue would look like in several years to come.
However, 59-year-old Joe Brunson on the 2nd floor apartment next door is not so optimistic about living on Joseph Avenue. His apartment is badly in need of repairs. Joe feels if the riots were supposed to make things better, somehow the changes missed him.
You asked the landlord about, stopping the leaks from coming in. What does he say?
I told him about it. He said, I'll get to it. You don't get nothing out of it 6 or 7 years, you never get to it.
How did Rochester's white community react to the riots? Pete Dubrovitz has a report on how public officials viewed the events of 20 years ago then and now.
There was a din in the air. I mean, a roar, and people clamoring, that noise, an unusual noise. And it seemed like it was daylight out.
There were 21 policemen on the streets in the entire city that night in July, and Bill Lombard was their chief.
I think the whole thing mushroomed, because it wasn't that tight. I think if the situation would have happened in January, I don't think all this would have happened.
Bobby Dankner was just a teenager in '64. Taking over his father's Quality Bakery would come much later, but he knew the avenue, Joseph Avenue, well.
First, and before any consideration can be given to any demands, there must be an end to violence and disorder on our streets.
Sure, we recognized we had some problems and we were working on them.
Frank Lamb had become Rochester's mayor just 6 months before. A phone call woke him up that night. The situation was out of control. A lawman, a baker, and a politician. What all began on the other side of this bridge 20 years ago touched each one of their lives, and the lessons learned then are still remembered vividly today. For Bill Lombard, a walk down Joseph Avenue is a walk down a street of missed opportunities, of frustrations. Lombard says changes to ease racial tensions were already well underway when things got out of hand that hot July night.
We have done a lot. That's probably one of the most frustrating things of that whole experience in the 60s, that that there was a real sincere effort by myself and by, the department as a whole, and particularly assigned command people, to improve the quality of services in the department. But yet you have that cynical reaction that you're the police, so you got to be down on us, and it was difficult to establish, a good dialogue.
And what was learned from this? Well, I mean, what came out of this that maybe changed the way things were done in the city police department?
What we learned was, again, that certainly the police were the primary means of protection in the community, to alleviate the fears and anxieties of a concerned community, and the burden was upon us to demonstrate the ability to meet that challenge. We needed training. We needed the recognition of being professionals, in the sense that the services that we were looked upon to perform were of a professional level. standards. We had already begun to raise the standards for selection of police.
Even though he was surrounded by throngs of angry people, his car overturned and stoned, Lombard says he never feared for his life. In fact, he says the whole experience didn't change his life at all.
You react instinctively, and you don't think about fear, and you don't think about how one incident changes your whole life. Certainly, it broadens your perspectives through that kind of experience and so forth. But it's a job to be done. You know that you're sworn to carry out this function, and so you perform to the best of your ability with what resources you have to do it with.
They're making turnovers in wedding cakes the way they have at Quality Bakery for 30 years. Aubie Dankner says the riots never touched his business, and in fact, in all that time, he's been robbed but once. That weekend generated a mental image that, according to Dankner, persists today, fostered by a media that's quick to turn the spotlight back on his street.
When that happened, a lot of people stopped coming, and there are still people to this day who are still a little bit leery to come down Joseph Avenue, and they won't come down Joseph Avenue unless they come with their husbands or what. But you know, this percentage of people you're going to have no matter if the problem was in Jefferson Road or in Brighton or in Pittsburgh, you'd still have the same situation. If Joseph Avenue was that bad or is that bad, or if our people were being molested, nobody would come to work for me. My girls would be afraid to work here, okay? But the problem is not that. The problem actually is the media that brings it across to be that way. There is not that much of a problem.
We had just started during this period in 1964 in the summer, and unfortunately it took too long from the time that you think of the idea and get it executed, it was far too long, and we had a number of programs underway, but that probably could have helped.
Frank Lamb says it's hard to tell just how out of touch White Rochester was with the problems faced by the black community.
Well, a lot of people thought Rochester was kind of smug back in those days, and I think probably still can be justified a trifle, but it certainly woke up a lot of people that things can happen. Maybe we weren't as good as we thought we were.
Lamb says he'd like his administration remembered not just for the riots, but for the sweeping changes brought about in the 7th Ward and the downtown business district. Before Lamb, Rochester was dead last in nationwide urban renewal efforts. By 1969, it had skyrocketed to number 11. The key, says Lamb, was cooperation.
It emphasized starting to work with people instead of planning for them. You planned with them.
Each of these men carries with them a story, one insight into the events of that weekend and beyond. Each reflects an attitude, the way it might have been, the way it might still be. For Lombard, it was that street dance scheduled to end at 11:30. The arrest that triggered the riot took place at 11:25.
Officers in the process of trying to get him out of there. One thing led to another. He resisted, and then he was ordered to be under arrest, and then the wagon was called, and then from that point it just, you know, others seized upon that as a means of turning upon the police, and a riot was born.
So 5 more minutes, and there's a possibility that may have never...
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it was, you know, it was something that we pondered as being rather unusual in the sense that they tolerated his annoyances and disorderliness, as it was reported in the reports I received, for about an hour.
For Dankner, it's the big news coverage of a small-time robbery.
There was a dentist on Joseph Avenue that he was robbed. Some party walked in right into his office and robbed his patients and assaulted him, okay? That made headlines. That made right front page, Joseph Avenue dentist assaulted. You know, the way it was put in that paper, it was, to me, the media could have played it down a little bit, but I understand that the media has to get the news across. It just, that seems to me that Joseph Avenue is always, it's always in big letters, okay, where it doesn't have to be.
For Lamb, it's the sightseeing trip he never got to take.
Had it not been that I was expecting a phone call from somebody, I probably would have been in that helicopter. I was looking out to the southwest and over in the Clarissa Street area and saw some smoke, and just in minutes someone came in and said that the helicopter had crashed. That I remember very distinctly because by the grace of God, I could have been in that helicopter.
Earlier today, Wanda Miller spoke with one of the city's black leaders about his recollections of the '64 riots. Anthony Reed is a former Monroe County legislator. He looks back at the riots as the beginning of some major changes for blacks.
I was among the few lucky black males in this community who was able to maintain employment and have a high income during those early years.
Do you recall specific instances where blacks were told they couldn't be hired, that the door was slammed in their faces, where the frustration was evident because of racism?
No, we've always had a very hostile form of racism in this community. It was very subtle, but it was there. It was there in employment, it was there in housing, it was there when it came to the educational system in our communities when we only had 2 bad schools. And unfortunately, those 2 bad schools were in the black community, school number 3 and school number 9.
What do you mean by bad?
The educational facilities that were going in the other schools who were beginning to deteriorate weren't going to school number 3 and school 9.
Let's talk about police relationships. What were they? How would you describe them back then, 1964?
Well, I think the police department in 1964 wasn't prepared, just like the city of Rochester, to handle blacks coming into the community. The blacks who were beginning to
migrate from
the South here. They weren't able to, psychologically, they weren't able to adjust to a large black population coming into.
How did that evidence itself? You say they weren't able to adjust. Did it come out symptomatically?
Well, basically, as the population began to change, there was no upbeat in recruitment for minority police officers at that time. Okay, there was no sensitive training like they have today. In other words, it was a black person out there with just something really to watch and, you know, to patrol. There was just no type of exchange between the young cops coming out on the beat at that time and the population.
Police dogs, were they used often?
Police dogs were used quite extensively, only in the black communities. At that time, I was working outside of the city. The year before I went to Kodak, Xerox, I worked at Kodak. I never seen dogs on Lake Avenue at that time.
What about allegations of police brutality? Did that exist back then? And has it changed now?
Oh, there were incidents every night. I mean, particularly on the weekend nights. There was always instances of police brutality as far as making arrests with, you know, the black population or whatever. There were many incidents that were just looked over. There were many incidents that were brought up by some of the leaders at that time, but nothing was ever done. There was never any communication established between the black community and the police department until after the riot.
1984. Have things changed?
Certainly they have. Our police officers now are better trained. They undergo a high quality of sensitive training. They are coached basically in how to handle different ethnic groups. The city police department now is on under a consent decree where they've got to hire so many minorities. And as these minorities are coming into the police department, they're also being trained right along with the young whites in how to handle those particular type of crises.
Could another riot occur in Rochester, either now or 2 or 3, 10 years from now?
Well, if it could happen, okay? And we never know what the economy is going to hold for us. Unfortunately, even though the country is undergoing a large unemployment problem, the city of Rochester, we're still somewhat holding our own. It isn't as good as it should be, and quite naturally, when the employment picture is bad, the blacks and Hispanics are going to suffer the most, okay? But I think we could hold our own, providing the economy maintains a steady balance. But if the economy gets bad, any worse than it is, we're going to be in for trouble.
In a moment, what have the past 20 years done for blacks in terms of jobs and housing opportunities, and in terms of the ongoing relationship with local police?
Those of us that are in leadership positions are finding it very difficult now to communicate with the police department.
Food so good, it's gotta be TJ's Big Boy. You know you should.
The People's Court has got the beefs.
He says, I don't know, I might have used it on somebody else's coat.
That's not true. That's a
yes,
lie.
you did.
Time.
Tune in a menu of meaty debates.
I didn't tell him that way. He's lying.
That's not true.
Then digest the verdict as Judge Wapner dishes it out.
You can't do that. It's not fair.
It's not always your way.
I think it's a very unfair decision.
But no beef's too small on the People's Court.
Weekdays at 5:30 on 13.
There's a feeling in the air that you can't get anywhere except in Rochester. I taste 1,000 yesterdays and I love the magic ways of Rochester. From the rolling countryside, we share the growing pride each time you touch the sky. From where the waters flow to Lake Ontario, we're all good neighbors passing by. Makes no difference where I go, you're the best hometown I know. Hello, Rochester. Hello, Rochester. 13 loves you.
In analyzing the causes of the disorders, many pointed to the relationships between the police department and the black community. David Burns has a report on the changing perceptions of the Rochester Police Department.
To a casual observer walking through Rochester's minority neighborhoods, there is little that reveals just how police and residents feel about each other. This officer has noticed several junked cars parked illegally on the street. After a few questions, the owners are found. Neighborhood teenagers pitch in to push the cars up into driveways. It takes a few tries, but the job gets done and there are no complaints.
People on this street, I feel I can speak for, because we are very close neighbors. We help each other. We watch out for each other. You know, it's not too many streets where your kids can run up and down and you don't have to worry about them. And trying to speak for everyone, I do feel that they find the police as being friends.
But if police and residents here are friends, they are friends that are no longer talking. This officer was clearly shocked to hear how well he rated. The city police department isn't talking much at all anymore, at least about this subject. The official position is no comment. But it's clear that there is suspicion on both sides, suspicion that progress made since the riots is slipping away.
We have terminated the police services of Thomas L. Whitmore.
The biggest single reason is the shooting last year of Alicia McCullough by Officer Thomas Whitmore. She was the daughter of one of the city's most prominent black leaders, James McCullough. Police called the shooting justifiable. The woman was allegedly trying to stab her boyfriend. But many minorities said it was just one more example of excessive use of force against their community.
We say no! We say no! We say no to nice Chief Justice! We say
One goal of minority leaders is to open up the police review process to public scrutiny. In the hallways of city courts, some defendants will say off camera that police verbally taunt minorities during arrests. And the so-called McCullough Commission, set up after the death of Alicia McCullough, is collecting information on more serious allegations. Non-minorities are demanding changes too.
Anyone who wants to make a complaint against a police officer must go through a very closed process, and the whole investigation is done within the department, so that even if it is a very good and fair investigation, people don't have confidence in it. And somehow it has to be opened up to the public scrutiny.
The police department and Police Chief Delmar Leach declined to answer questions for this report or appear on camera. Minority leaders say they too are having trouble getting answers.
The communities that I live and work in, and those of us that are in leadership positions, are finding it very difficult now to communicate with the police department. They'll talk to you on the phone, but heretofore they used to come to meetings and discuss issues and help plan ways to avert some of the problems that the issues are generating they're no longer willing to do that.
There has been a lot of change, but the change I don't think has been progressively stable. In other words, there has been progress and then there has been regress.
Hall and Burgos both say there is great potential to close the gulf that has opened between police and minorities. But both say they want genuine commitment, not just grudging concessions. Until someone takes a step forward, the relationship that has been building for 20 years is in serious jeopardy.
Minority housing and jobs, two major problems. In the 1960s, 1 out of every 5 families in the inner city lived in housing described as unfit for human habitation. Doug Embledge has a report.
Financially, if you got a good job, then you're going to have good housing because you'll be able to afford it. You can't do one without the other.
There are still people in this neighborhood who remember the conditions that led to the riots, and they say it still isn't easy to get a job or find a decent place to live. It seems like ancient history. In 1960, the average black family in Rochester earned $2,000 less per year than the average white family. But the 1980 census shows the gap is even greater now, $5,000. The poverty level in 1980 was $7,356 a year for a family of 4. Almost a third of black families in Rochester were earning less, compared to only 8% of white families. Low-income housing in the early 60s was crowded. The Hanover houses crammed 1,700 people into less than 400 apartments. In 1968, the heyday for public housing began with the Fair Housing Act and the Federal Housing Act. Government dollars poured into Rochester to build low-rise townhouses and apartments with more space for recreation. And after a lull in the mid-70s, there was more federal housing money available under Jimmy Carter. But today, construction of public housing has virtually stopped. The federal government is stepping out of its role as provider of a place for the poor to live. The director of the Rochester Housing Council says we won't see the impact of that change right away, but Gene Kramer says he expects a return to more crowded housing in the next decade. Crowding today is certainly not the problem it was in 1964. That year, there were 400 public housing units in the city. This year, there are 2,500, and many low-income families live in one of another 2,500 units that are under a federal provision called Section 8. Tenants pay 30% of their income as rent. The government pays the rest. The government helped Ted Brown keep his Flint Street home when he retired on disability. A federal subsidy helps him make the mortgage payments.
I got nobody to boss me. You know what I mean? I like that when I do my own thing. You see, now, if I was renting, see, the landlord be telling me I can't do this, I can't do that.
Just about every Rochester neighborhood has improved in the last 20 years. Some have been brought back to the point that low-income families are pushed out. Property values and rents have skyrocketed in the Cornhill area, just west of the river and south of Broad Street. And the wedge between South Avenue and South Clinton is headed in the same direction. The Housing Council says the big problem now isn't the number of units, but the number of decent units that the poor can afford. Single people on welfare are given $186 a month for shelter. That includes utilities. The last 20 years hasn't been without progress. Many blacks are now suburban homeowners. In the city in the 1970s, the black population grew by about a quarter, but the number of blacks in suburban Monroe County more than doubled. The reason is better jobs. Janetta Whitley is a restaurant hostess. It's a job she says she never could have gotten 20 years ago.
We felt like that we were still basically kind of like in slavery. You know, you go downtown for a job and you were qualified, but because your face was black, you couldn't get it.
Al Kinney owns 3 businesses on Plymouth Avenue. He says the key to success is desire. Kinney wanted to be his own boss and has been for more than a decade.
I was able to accomplish more. I felt if I worked this week and I made $100 and I needed $150, I had a chance to make it if I worked for myself. But by working for someone else, I didn't have that chance.
For blacks, job hunting is still emotionally tough, and it's not easy keeping a positive attitude.
Without that, you have no cause. You have no cause to do or continue doing what you're doing. There's no progress, no room for progress. If you're not mentally strong, then you're too weak to do it. You got to believe that you can do.
Since the riots, affirmative action has helped many blacks by creating opportunities that weren't there before. These programs were designed to make up for past injustices, but when the economy turned down, many blacks found themselves on the wrong end of the seniority list.
The black people were the last to hire. Now they're the first to be laid off, and the economy is so that you just can't find a job. You can't, if you got 10 or 15 years on your job now, they start laying off. We're the first to go.
Still, since 1964, the number of black police officers and other civil servants has skyrocketed. So has the number of blacks in key positions in local industry. Tom Hastings of Rochester Jobs says Rochester's employment picture is brighter than many cities. But the numbers don't paint such a bright picture. Unemployment for young blacks is in the area of 40% in Rochester. 1964 seems like ancient history. Some things have gotten better for blacks in this city, but progress depends on point of view.
Yeah, I was seeing it good in '64. I didn't have to want for nothing. I had plenty of money in the bank, see? And after I got sick, I had to spend part of my money for my doctor bill, and don't seem like I can get any back. You see what I mean?
And progress is good for a few, and progress is bad for a few, or for many.
People are hungry, and some people don't want to sink as low as to actually go to the welfare. We do have pride. We came a long way, and now we're losing ground, and I feel like we're slipping right back into the 60s.
In the years after the riots, the black community would stand united in many areas, including entertainment. A black-owned and operated radio station was evidence of that fact. Andrew Langston runs WDKX. He remembers the riots as the turning point. This afternoon, he shared his memories of 1964 with Wanda Miller.
I came here to get a job with background in New York, and I was told, in essence, don't call us, we'll call you. I was told you have too much education. That's the first time I was told that. Now, that was training that I had in finance, banking, and manufacturing, also communication.
But the real reason was what?
The real reason was prejudice. I can't think of another way of putting it than saying the way it was.
What was the relationship between blacks and whites, the white community and the black community? Was there hostility? Was there overt hate and racism? Or did blacks and whites kind of just ignore one another?
Well, I believe it was the lack of understanding and knowledge of one another. It's what you don't know you fear. As an example, Rochester is a highly technological center with industry here, several industries in the top 500. Well, we migrated here from where? From the South, various points of the South. We got here via where? The bean farms in the outlying area, and we stayed because it looked like a better place to live. Well, when we found that we were ill prepared, in some instances, to get gainful employment, then we became frustrated because there was not a chance to get a job. Now, here's another picture you must see here. Rochester did not understand having an influx of blacks what it didn't have before. We're talking about, let's go back to the 60s when we came. We came here in July of 1960. There were a few blacks, maybe 25 to 30,000. Today, by Standard Rate and Data Service survey, they allege there's around 97,000 blacks here. Okay? Now, but 98.6% of that population is where? In Monroe County. So in the other outlying counties, you got less than 2% of the population. Well, when you get that kind of influx, all right, then something has to give. Housing is not open to you. Then you go into the homes where you feel as though you can live, but in a way you don't want to live there because it's low-cost housing. But with that breeds frustration and overcrowdedness.
Let's talk a little bit about police relations back in 1964. How would you define and characterize black and police relationships?
Well, first of all, we have always been on the end of a police nightstick. Yet the police is to protect you. When we came to Rochester in 1964, that was, I think, Charlie Price was the only policeman here. Now, that's one policeman, and said the population was 20,000 plus. Well, that's not adequate representation to cover a community like that. So what happens with that is the police doesn't understand the mores of the black community. So when they go in, there's a family disturbance because of frustration. Perhaps it's a health reason as well. Many things cause one to be frustrated. And the policemen go in with lack of understanding, and then they resort to force. And I guess when you have a gun and a blackjack, not knowing that you have to protect the citizen, you protect them the way you think is best to.
Would you say, some have said that police were the direct object of that black frustration that you spoke of, and as a result, that may have indirectly caused the riots?
Well, it has been said that was some of the major cause, because the way the police had treated the residents of the area where the riot originally started. And I am led to believe that was one of the major causes.
1984, police relations today in the black community, much better?
Wanda, I have to look at that and say, where have we come since 1964, 1984, 20 years later? I would say what has been given or alleged to be available to us in the 60s has all been eroded slowly but surely. Are you ready for this? On the national level in the 80s. As an example, sure, you have police brutality. As you can cite certain cases that took place. Now, that is, I believe, because of a lack of understanding on the police department part, as well as employment of minorities on the police force. The other part about that is this. The administration of a lot of things given under the Commission, the Civil Rights, under the Democratic administration, as an example, Head Start program, educational program, housing program, etc., equal opportunity employment, and communication. Show cause where a community could be serviced, it's not being serviced. Now they have a cutie, now they call deregulation, where I cannot see where blacks can own a radio station or a television station, because now it's the person who can afford to pay for that, not given any consideration otherwise. And where are we now? I believe it is eroding, and it's just as bad. If anything, in a lot of instances, worse than it was in the 60s.
20 years ago, I think for anyone here in Rochester 20 years ago, certainly the memory of the riots lives on over the past couple of decades. Dick, we've already established that you were here at Channel 13 20 years ago on the air reporting it. I, ironically, was over at Channel 8 20 years ago working as a summer relief technician, and recall going out with a camera to try to capture some of what was going on. I guess as I look back on it, the one word that would come to mind was disbelief, that something like this, first of all, could be happening. As we drove into those areas and looked at the damage and kind of sensed the mood of people, really one of surprise on our part, I would think, the news media.
A real shock, particularly for the white community. They just didn't believe such a thing could happen in our Rochester. That's true.
Frank Lamb referred to the smug town image, saying that Rochester was kind of a smug
Kurt
town
Gurley, the author's appellation for the city of Rochester, Smug Town, wrote a book about it. I'm not so sure that that's a fair characterization of the city. Some may think of it as being smug. Certainly, I think everybody would agree there was a great deal of civic pride. People were very proud of Rochester. It was a unique community in that respect. There were many things to point to with pride. They thought they were very progressive. They thought that they had achieved a great deal. And you may call it smug, but I think that it was perhaps honest pride in what they'd achieved.
Certainly a point of embarrassment, though, to be one of those that receiving national coverage for something that was happening like that.
That's right, because I believe there had been a disturbance in New York City and Birmingham, Alabama, but Rochester was one of the first northern cities to be hit by the civil disorder that permeated the middle 60s. In a sense, Rochester was a leader.
I'm looking back as we talk about that element of surprise, and people have raised the question throughout our program tonight, could something like this happen again? Could a riot happen again? I think, first of all, if we were surprised by it 20 years ago, obviously the police department probably was too, and their whole attitude of what happens in those areas has changed.
Yeah. No one should ever, we never use the term never, because anything can happen again. As you drive through the areas of Rochester, the 3rd and 7th Ward today, it's physically entirely different. And it's as I look back, the housing conditions were so deplorable. I mean, really, vermin and rodents. The housing conditions were abominable. And I could understand people that had no interest in their housing because certainly no pride in it could rebel in that sense. It's hard, though, to go through those areas around Genesee Street and see so many very well-kept homes, with well-kept lawns, and people with obvious pride in their property. That would seem to me to mitigate against having disorders again.
And certainly, too, just the procedures. I can recall for 2 or 3 summers after the riots, the police department making it very clear to news departments that if something happens, the very first thing that will happen is the area is sealed off. News media won't be just allowed to go plunging through there and reporting perhaps something that might trigger further violence.
You know, a lot of times people do love to point to the media as being the instigator, the thing that causes trouble. Of course, we take the other position that we think we may help to alleviate some of the stress. But many of the reporting techniques have changed in the past 20 years. Back in the 1960s and prior to that time, it was standard procedure for a journalist to go to the primary source. You go to the official spokesman, the mayor, the city manager, the police chief, and you get the official version of what was going on. And that's what you relayed over your newscast. Today, we have more equipment, more technology. We're able to go not only to the established authority, but to the people and find out what their actions and their responses and what their feelings are. I think that we've broadened our coverage of news an enormous amount in the past 20 years.
I think, and perhaps sadly so, as a result of the riots, we certainly not only broadened our coverage, but perhaps paid more attention where we may not have. There was the Fight organization, of course, growing out of that, the backing of the Council of Churches. I remember when George Hill, with the Rochester Area Council of Churches, got behind that and kind of elevated it to the forefront where we all began to pay more attention to it.
Yes, I think the point that Frank Lamb, former Mayor Lamb, made, that if we learned anything, it was you don't plan for people, you plan with people. And that was one of the, I don't know if that was brought out enough. The organizations, the Fight organization, ABC, all of the organizations that have been established and that have learned that you plan with people, you get them involved in what you hope is progress in moving the community forward.
One question I touched upon earlier, and we answered to some degree, could a riot ever happen again? I sometimes wonder, in looking at this program tonight, what would have happened if, as Chief Lombard pointed out at the time, 5 minutes later, the riot had been averted, if there had been no riot? Would it have been inevitable, and would change have come anyway?
I don't know as I share his view that it would not have happened. Might another incident and another evening, the same circumstances. I think the mood was there. The opportunity presented itself that given day, that given evening. Had it not been on July 25th, it could have been some other day. That's
Dick, thank you for joining us this evening, as well as for all of your reports in this program. And coming up next, how you and your neighbors feel about the riots and their impact on the Rochester community.
And it make not only Rochester, it make other cities be more conscious of the needs of the minorities.
Save 20 to 40% store-wide at Marple's summer sale on brand name furniture, carpeting, and bedding. Hurry for these savings at either Marple Furniture, Hilton, or Fairport.
Do you dare to watch the truth?
Definitely.
The whole truth.
May I remind you you're under oath?
And nothing but the truth?
Yes, sir.
Then raise the volume and take your seat. The People's Court is for you.
Let me explain it a little better.
Every day, Judge Wapner presides.
What did you use to break his windshield?
I didn't break his windshield.
That's a good answer. You know,
And every case is a challenge.
You're suing your grandmother?
Yes.
Real people bring their conflict to court.
At this time, she attacked me from behind. She dug her fingernails in my face and in my neck.
And real emotions take the stand.
She abandoned my mourning, senile father.
When all the evidence is seen and heard.
Let me take a recess. Go ahead. Thank you.
The People's Court is the winner.
You're to be congratulated.
Thank you.
The People's Court.
Weekdays at 5:30 on 13. Information about youth employment programs in Rochester and Monroe County is available through CYO's Job Helpline. Youth 14 to 21 years of age can call and get a referral to the program best suited to fit their needs. Call the Job Helpline at 232-2420. Just a phone call away.
Working 9 to 5 in an office can be hectic. Watch.
Advocate's
I checked
office.
on that
Just
bill.
a second,
Still
let me
in
check.
committee, and I don't see much chance of it passing.
Yes, that bill did pass in the Senate.
Coffee wagon. Disability, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder.
20 years since the riots. How can one measure the progress? As we've done in this program tonight, I think we tend to measure it as a whole in terms of society. We mention things we can point to: more jobs, better housing, a sense of recognition of the black community. The real progress, though, I suspect, is within. Not so easy to point to our thoughts, our feelings. Not so much how we treat minorities, but rather how we truly feel about them. Only you can measure that progress, as each one of us ponders the riots of
But
1964.
it brought a lot of changes to Rochester. And it make not only Rochester, it make other cities be more conscious of the needs of the minorities, especially the black.
I would say worse came out of the riots more than good.
How come?
Well, a lot of property got destroyed, and it just isn't being rebuilt properly.
There were people who live in a vacuum and who think that it couldn't happen here in Rochester and that everything is rosy and peaches in Rochester when things aren't as peachy and creamy as one would tend to think.
I really think it brought to light some of the problems that people had that if you didn't live in that area you weren't really aware of.
Made people wake up and observe the others' need, or the needs of others. See, but tearing up your own community doesn't make any sense.
I think we've learned that we've got to start working together a little bit more. We've got to cooperate better. I think things have improved. The relationship seems to be a little bit better. Seems to be able to work together with people easier than what we did then. I don't think there's, maybe as much distrust or prejudice as there used to be.